What up, it's your boy T Run Reaction. So today I'm doing some video game reaction, and I want to run back to wrestling with gaming as well too. And I thought this was a cool story to check out as well too. It's story now before we had DLCs and all that stuff. We used to get games by simply putting cheat codes on it as well too. But when cheat codes wasn't enough, there was a extra enhancement mechanism in video games around time for consoles such as Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear, and many others as well too. Though, but not for the newer generations such as a PlayStation and all that as well too. They had their own. This was a enhancement called Game Genie, which comes with a booklet. They give you the mechanism of putting certain codes in for certain games to get certain enhancements to games such as infinite lives, game stage selects, endless continues, etc. As well as if you want a good challenge, make your game do stuff to make your game even harder. So other than that though, we're going to check the story of Game Genie. So without further ado, let's check out the story behind Game Genie, and for those who was a early kid gamer like myself, or a teen gamer, or a gamer in general around the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s well too, this is going to bring back some memories. Let's get it.
Cheating in video games has been around nearly as long as video games themselves. The first cheat codes were put in place for playtesting purposes, seeing how developers and playtesters both needed a quick and easy way to test out the game's mechanics. In the early days of 8-bit computers, users could load games into memory, and before launching the game, modify specific memory addresses in order to get an unlimited number of lives, continues, immunity, or just change the mechanics of the game altogether. Even though the process to temporarily alter a game on computers like the Spectrum CX or the Commodore 64 was cumbersome, at least it was possible. The closed nature of consoles like the NES made using a cheat that wasn't purposely left in by the developer practically impossible. All of that changed when in 1990, a device made altering and cheating on console games almost as easy as popping in a cartridge itself. Today we're going to discuss the story of the Game Genie.
You cast them aside, exiled to the closet. You thought the challenge was gone. You were wrong. Rescue them. Get your old video games out of the closet and play them like new with Game Genie. Yep. Game Genie lets you change levels, jump higher, punch harder, live forever. Uncover the new power in most of your old video games with Game Genie.
Excellent! Yep, I remember that. Excellent.
System Game Genie from Galoob.
The Game Genie was designed by the UK company Codemasters, and sold by Camerica in Canada and by Galoob in the US. Mostly known for selling Micro Machines toys, this would be Galoob's first foray into the video game market, while Camerica already had a relationship with Codemasters as the Canadian distributor for their games. The Game Genie was originally called the Power Pack, a play on Game Pack, which was Nintendo's official name for its cartridges.
Yep.
Codemasters' Power Pack name was a bit of a strange choice. You see, Codemasters was known for producing unlicensed Nintendo games and knew how litigious Nintendo could be firsthand. Galoob was the third largest toy company in the US and had an equally large legal team providing guidance. So, to avoid legal issues with Nintendo, Galoob wisely rebranded the device as the Game Genie, with Camerica agreeing to follow suit. However, this wouldn't be enough to keep Nintendo's lawyers away. Galoob announced the Game Genie on May 8th of 1990. Nintendo of America then sued Galoob and Camerica 2 months later for copyright infringement. Nintendo demanded that they stop marketing the Game Genie, which was scheduled to hit store shelves in late July 1990 for a retail price of about $50. Nintendo claimed that the Game Genie created an illegal derivative work. Because of the court battle, the release of the Game Genie had to be postponed. Camerica won its legal battle in Canada fairly quickly, and the Game Genie was on Canadian retailer shelves by late 1990. Things took a little longer to get straightened out in the US, but in July of 1991, U.S. District Court Judge Fern Smith ruled in favor of Galoob in their court battle against Nintendo. In fact, Galoob later received $16 million from Nintendo as compensation for lost profit in 1990 and 1991 stemming from Nintendo's lawsuit delaying the sale of the Game Genie. The Game Genie attaches between a cartridge and the console and is what's known as a pass-through device. After powering on the console, instead of the game's usual opening, the user is greeted with a Game Genie menu that's used to enter in.
I always wanted with the Nintendo one, like, because I got the Game Genie I got was for a Super Nintendo and Game Boy.
Series of codes. These codes allow the player to manipulate various aspects of games by temporarily swapping out the integer values in certain addresses of the ROM on the game cartridge with values the Game Genie creates based on the code entered in its menu. It was possible for users to create their own random Game Genie codes, but these codes rarely resulted in any changes, or worse, would just make the game freeze. This wasn't a major problem since the Game Genie came with a booklet of codes for use with various games available for the system. However, new codes needed to continue to be developed since new games were released after the booklets were published. To address this, Galoob created a paid subscription service where subscribers would receive quarterly code updates. In addition, Galoob also ran ads in gaming magazines such as GamePro that featured codes for newer games. Despite having won its legal battles, Galoob and Camerica were concerned about the device's image, and thus it was marketed as a game enhancer as opposed to being sold as a cheating device.
Right.
They were not, however, concerned about being sued by the studio that produced Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and blatantly ripped off their characters in their TV commercials.
Yo, video game dudes, talk to me! Excellent!
Yo.
It's Game Genie from Galoob, the awesome video game enhancer for your Nintendo Entertainment System. Attach it to most of your video games, like Double Dragon 2, Super Mario Bros. 3. And buckle up, cause you'll do what no video dude has done before. You can go to any level, get unlimited lives, live forever, like a video zombie. Excellent! You'll jump totally higher. Make your own effects. And Game Genie gives you more firepower. Go for it, Dudester.
Go to any level, jump higher, stay bigger, live forever. Game Genie, the radical video game enhancer from Galoob.
Before the lawsuit, Galoob supposedly approached Nintendo about having the Game Genie distributed as an officially licensed Nintendo product, an offer that Nintendo obviously turned down. Sega, on the other hand, fully endorsed the Game Genie with their seal of approval. In addition to the original NES version, Game Genie devices were also released for the Super NES, Game Boy, Sega Genesis, and Sega Game Gear. Each version, however, had its own particular quirks. The NES Game Genie attaches to the end of the NES cartridge, causing the cartridge to protrude from the console when it's fully inserted. This makes pressing the cartridge down impossible. Therefore, the Game Genie was designed in such a way that it did not need to be depressed in order to start the game. This design put more stress on the LIF socket than a standard game insertion would. It would bend the pins and eventually cause units to be unplayable without the Game Genie present. The design of the Game Genie also made it very difficult to insert into a newer top-loading NES without pressing down very, very hard. An adapter was created to deal with the problem, which Galoob offered to Game Genie owners free of charge. The Super Nintendo Game Genie did not work with Super NES games that contained a performance-enhancing chip, but did offer an updated version to address these problems with some games such as Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. It also has problems with the SNS 101 remodel SNES. When used with a SNES 101, only 2 codes can be used at a time, and they must be entered on the top and bottom lines of the Game Genie menu. The Game Boy Edition similarly has a slot for cartridges, while itself needing to be inserted into the console's game slot. It also has 2 physical buttons for toggling codes on or off, or to return to the code input screen. The physical design of the Game Boy Game Genie made it difficult to be used with any version of the Game Boy other than the original. It could be made to work with the Game Boy Pocket or the Game Boy Color, but to do so, the Game Genie would need to be bent backwards, placing strain on the mechanism that would allow it to be pressed down far enough to reach the Game Boy Pocket or Game Boy Color cartridge contacts. On the Mega Drive/Genesis, the Game Genie can function as a country converter cartridge, since most of these games are only locked to their respective regions by the shape of the cartridges and a few bytes of data in the header of the ROM. Although the Game Genie was fully endorsed by Sega, they did require that the Game Genie not work with games that included a save feature, likely to avoid the save data file itself being altered. The Game Gear version of the Game Genie had a slightly more complicated design than the other systems. When the Game Genie was inserted into the cartridge slot, another slot would pop up to insert the Game Gear cartridge. It also had a compartment which contained a book of codes. The codes were printed on sticky labels to put on the back of a Game Gear cartridge. When entering codes, the player could easily see what to type in rather than look through the book.
I think I think in the Game Boy did the same thing too. It had a little sticker put on it as well too, though. I think, because I remember half the games I had still had the stickers on it that I remember. Yup.
The Game Genie sold about 1.6 million units in the US and Europe during its first year on the market. Nintendo attempted to prevent the Game Genie from working with their systems through hardware redesigns and ROM checksums that could detect cheat modifications.
That's part why they did this reverse. And getting that version of the Nintendo a while back though, when I think because at that time I got the Nintendo again at the time because I was doing I'll give it to a piano lesson, and it was a piano game I hooked up to Nintendo to do it as well too. I think the Nintendo version was cheaper than the Super Nintendo because I already had that, but yeah.
These measures weren't very successful. Galoob provided free adapters to circumvent hardware changes. Some ROM checksums could be bypassed just with Game Genie codes, and for those that couldn't, an updated version of the Game Genie had the ability to hide its modification from the checksum routine altogether. A more powerful device for the Super Nintendo, dubbed the Game Genie 2, was developed by Codemasters. This updated device would feature many improvements, including the ability for users to more easily create their own cheat codes, the ability to selectively activate cheats during gameplay using the game controller, the ability to switch games into a slow motion mode, as well as automatically save and restore the high scores from games saved into battery-backed memory on the Game Genie device itself. A fully working prototype of the device was completed, but was not released due to changes in market conditions. As a kid, I loved the Game Genie. It let me do more than just cheat on my games. It let me do cool things like play as the bosses from Street Fighter 2 in Versus mode. Something I never thought I was going to be able to do, at least not on that first port that came to the Super Nintendo. Sadly, on January 1st of 1997, Galoob announced that they were discontinuing support and development for the Game Genie. Still, like most things from the 90s, the Game Genie survives to this day. You can find it online in Nintendo emulators, Super Nintendo emulators, really almost any emulator that had a version of the Game Genie come out for it. And even more impressive than that, there's still a vibrant online community creating new codes for the Game Genie.
Wow, that's pretty awesome.
If you like this video and want to see more,
and there you have it though. So the other one you kind of see on the top left though, that's what was the thing for cheat codes for the newer games like the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation and I think Sega Saturn and many others as well too. But yeah, this brought back memories as well too, man. I remember I used it for the Spider-Man, X-Men, Arcade Revenge. I definitely used it for Super Mario World as well too. I used it for Mortal Kombat, and with that, I was able to get it. I was able to easily fight against Reptile a little quicker too, as well too. And many other games I had on too. Game Boy did a good amount as well too, but I think not everything worked. But other than that though, this brought back some memories though. So of like time I was using the Game Boy, the Game Genie as well. So yeah, other than that. If you like my reaction, like, share, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Shout out to Wrestling with Gaming, bringing back some fond memories of us, of gamers all over the world. It's your boy T-Bear signing off. One love.